Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The pot roast had been in the oven since 10 o'clock that morning. I remember that detail clearly because I had woken up earlier than usual, my mind already buzzing with the quiet, purposeful energy that only comes when you're preparing something for people you love. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic by the time my husband Gerald shuffled into the kitchen in his slippers, squinting at the light above the stove as though it had personally offended him. Up early, he said. Big day, I reminded him. He poured his coffee and nodded slowly, the way men of 68 nod when they're still assembling themselves. Our son Thomas was coming home. Not just Thomas and Priya, his wife of 3 years, and their daughter Mila, who had just turned 2 and whom we had only seen twice in person because they lived in Portland and life, as it does, kept getting in the way. And this time, Thomas's sister Joanne would be there with her husband Dale and their teenage boys Marcus and Eli. A full house. A real family dinner, the kind I used to dream about when the kids were small and I didn't yet understand how rare those moments would become. I had set the long dining table with the good china, the cream-colored set with the blue border that Gerald's mother had given us as a wedding gift, and that spent most of its life wrapped in felt inside a cabinet. I had ironed the linen napkins. I had made a centerpiece out of sunflowers from the garden because Mila, according to Thomas, had recently become obsessed with the color yellow. Everything was intentional. Everything was done with love. They arrived in two separate cars almost simultaneously, which felt like a small miracle. Joanne and Dale pulled into the driveway just as Thomas's rental was coming down the street, and there was a beautiful, chaotic moment in the front yard where everyone was hugging at once, and Marcus and Eli, 16 and 14 respectively, and therefore legally required to act as though hugging grandparents was mildly embarrassing, submitted to my embraces with the particular stiffness of boys who secretly don't mind. Mila was extraordinary. I had seen photographs, of course. Priya sent them regularly, careful and thoughtful in that way she was about maintaining connection across distance. But photographs had not prepared me for the reality of this child, the dark curls, the enormous brown eyes, the way she looked at everything as though the world were a series of gifts being unwrapped specifically for her. She toddled up the front steps holding Thomas's hand, and when she saw the sunflowers on the hall table, she let out a sound that wasn't quite a word but communicated pure, uncomplicated joy. She remembers you, Priya said, watching me crouch down to Mila's level. Priya smiled. I show her your pictures, I tell her that's Nana Ruth. She points at the phone and says Nana. I stood up and hugged Priya then, properly, the way I hadn't quite managed the first few times we'd met, when I was still learning the shape of her, still figuring out the architecture of who my son had chosen. She hugged me back just as firmly, and over her shoulder I caught Gerald's eye and he gave me a small nod, the private language of a long marriage, saying, yes, this is good, this is exactly right. Dinner came together the way good dinners do, noisily, warmly, with several small disasters that became stories before they were even finished happening. Eli knocked over a glass of sparkling water reaching for the bread basket. Marcus, recruited to help carry dishes, dropped a serving spoon and it clattered across the hardwood floor and slid under the sideboard. Gerald told his story about the fishing trip to Montana, the one he'd told at every family gathering for 11 years, and Thomas and Joanne groaned at exactly the right moments with the fond exasperation of children who have memorized their father's mythology. Mila sat in the high chair we had borrowed from the neighbors, eating small pieces of soft potato with tremendous concentration and occasionally offering them to whoever was nearest, which was her version of generosity. Priya was quieter than the rest of us, but she had always been that way, observant, thoughtful, someone who listened before she spoke. I had learned not to mistake her stillness for distance. She was engaged in everything, she just processed the world at a different frequency than our family, which ran, generally, at the volume of a high school gymnasium. The wine was poured. The pot roast was carved. Someone, I think it was Dale, made a toast about family and togetherness that was earnest enough to be slightly embarrassing and sincere enough that we all meant it when we raised our glasses. For a while, everything was exactly as I had imagined it would be. It was Joanne who started it, though I don't believe she meant any harm. Joanne rarely did. She was like a weather system, generating turbulence naturally without malice, simply because she moved through the world at high speed and didn't always notice what her passage disturbed. She was talking about the renovations she and Dale were doing on their house. The kitchen remodel, the new floors, the ongoing negotiation with a contractor whose relationship with deadlines was, according to Joanne, spiritual rather than practical. It was an entertaining story, and we were all laughing, and then somehow the conversation turned, as conversations at family tables tend to, toward the future. Thomas, Joanne said, pointing her fork in her brother's direction with the casual authority of an older sister. When are you two going to move back closer to home? Mila's getting so big. Mom and Dad aren't getting any younger, Joanne, Gerald said mildly. Just saying what everyone's thinking. Portland is so far. Especially now that, we love Portland, Thomas said, and there was something careful in his voice, a slight flattening of tone that I recognized as the voice he used when he was managing something. I looked at Priya. She was looking at her plate, turning her fork slowly in her hand. There was something in her posture that I couldn't quite read, a tension in her shoulders, a quality of stillness that was different from her usual stillness. This wasn't the stillness of someone listening. This was the stillness of someone deciding. It's good for Mila, Priya said without looking up. Our life there, our community, of course, I said quickly. Of course it is. Priya's parents are in Vancouver, Thomas added. It's only a few hours' drive. It makes sense for us to be on the west coast. I understand that, Joanne said, and to her credit, her voice had lost its breezy certainty, had become something more careful. I wasn't trying to. No, it's fine, Priya said. But the air had changed. There was a new quality to the silence between sentences, a slight self-consciousness that hadn't been there before. Mila, oblivious and magnificent, held out a piece of potato to Marcus, who accepted it with more grace than I would have expected from a 16-year-old boy. It was Gerald who tried to shift the conversation, something about the weather in October, a question for Dale about his job. And it worked partially. The noise resumed. The wine was refilled. I got up to bring out the bread that had been keeping warm in the oven, and when I came back, things seemed mostly recovered, the conversation flowing again in its loose, branching way. But I kept watching Priya. Dessert was apple cake, Mila's second encounter with sugar in any meaningful quantity, apparently based on Thomas's expression of theatrical apprehension as I cut her a small slice. She ate it with both hands with a commitment that suggested she understood instinctively that this was one of life's more important experiences. We were all laughing at her again, the way you laugh at a small child's joy because it is uncomplicated and true, when Gerald, who had been telling a story about his own mother's apple cake, about a Sunday dinner from his own childhood 50 years ago, said something without meaning anything particular by it. He was talking about tradition, about the way food carries memory, and he said, "That's what I love about these dinners. This is how families are supposed to be, everyone together. The same table, the same recipes, generation after generation." He meant it as a warmth, as a benediction over the meal, and then Priya said it quietly, not aggressively, not even loudly enough to cut through the conversation cleanly, so that there was a half-second where the sentence hung in the air before it landed, before everyone had heard it, before the room understood what had been said. She said, "Not every family gets to have that. 4 words. 5 if you count the contraction as 2. The house fell silent, not the theatrical silence of a dramatic moment in a film with a musical sting and meaningful close-ups. The ordinary, uncomfortable silence of a table full of people who have all heard the same thing and are each separately deciding what it means and what is required of them. Mila broke it first, the way small children break silences without awareness, holding up her fork and saying something that was either more or moon, we were never entirely sure, and Thomas took her fork and gave her a small piece of cake, and the gesture bought 30 seconds maybe of breathing room, but no one had missed it. I looked at Priya. She wasn't looking at Gerald with anger. She wasn't performing the statement, wasn't underlining it with expression or posture. She was looking at her plate again, that careful stillness, and I thought, she didn't plan that. It had come from somewhere real, had surfaced the way true things surface without invitation after being held down long enough. I thought about what I knew of Priya's family. Her parents had emigrated from Mumbai in the early 90s. She had one brother, Vikram, who had died 7 years ago at 31, a car accident on a highway outside of Seattle. I had only learned this the previous year from Thomas, mentioned in passing and then never elaborated upon because Priya did not elaborate upon it. I knew that her mother had not been well in recent years. I knew, though I was only now assembling the pieces, that the apple cake and the Sunday dinners and the generations seated at the same table were a kind of abundance that not everyone arrived at the table carrying. Gerald, to his credit, understood immediately. I saw it in his face, not defensiveness, not confusion, but the particular expression of a man who has said something true about his own life and is recognizing with genuine sorrow that it arrived as an unintentional contrast to someone else's. "Priya," he said. She looked up. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was thoughtless of me." "You don't have to." "No," he said. "I do. I was talking about my family, about my good fortune, and I made it sound like a universal when it isn't. That wasn't fair." Silence that followed this was different from the first one. Softer, weighted differently. Thomas put his hand on Priya's hand on the table, and she turned her hand over and held his, and for a moment they were just two people holding onto each other in the middle of everything that marriage is, which is also everything that life is. "Vikram used to love apple cake," Priya said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to be steady. We could all hear that. "He had a sweet tooth. It was, my mother used to say, it was her greatest achievement, raising one child with taste and one child who would eat anything." A small, private smile. "Vikram was the one with taste. What was he like?" I asked. I asked because I wanted to know, but also because I understood in that moment that the question was what the moment needed. Not comfort, not deflection, not the urge to smooth things over and return to easier conversation. The question was what was required. Priya looked at me for a moment as if checking something, as if confirming that the question was genuine. Then she talked about her brother. She talked for a long time. About the way he laughed, which was too loud for restaurants and exactly right for everything else. About how he had been the one in the family to learn their mother's recipes, not Priya, because Priya had always been impatient in the kitchen, always ready to move on to the next thing, while Vikram could spend an entire Sunday afternoon making one dish and considering it time well spent. About how he had called her every Sunday morning without fail, for the 6 years between when she moved to the United States for university and when he died, and how for a long time after she would wake up on Sunday mornings and reach for her phone before she remembered. Marcus and Eli were completely still. I had never seen Marcus completely still before. Thomas held Priya's hand and didn't speak, because he had heard these stories before and knew that what they needed was room, not commentary. Mila had fallen asleep in the high chair, which was perhaps the most perfect and most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen. This new life, this beginning, sleeping softly while her mother spoke about an ending. By the time we cleared the dessert plates, something had shifted in the house. Not everything was resolved. Grief doesn't resolve over a single dinner. Family dynamics don't transform in an evening. And the distance between Portland and home remained exactly what it had been when they pulled into the driveway. None of the logistical facts of our lives had changed. But something had, later after Thomas had carried a sleeping Mila upstairs and Joanne and Dale had helped with the dishes, and the boys had retreated to the living room with their phones, I found Priya on the back porch. She was standing with a cup of tea, looking at the garden in the early evening light. I stood beside her. "I don't usually do that," she said after a moment. "You don't have to apologize." "I'm not apologizing, I'm just," she paused, chose the word carefully. Explaining, "I know, I love Thomas's family," she said. "I want you to know that. I love that Mila gets to have this. The grandparents, the cousins, the Sunday dinners, I want her to have all of it." "Has all of it," I said, "and she has your stories about Vikram, those are hers too." Priya was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked you," she finally said. "He liked people who woke up early to cook for people they loved." I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been better than the silence. We stood in the garden until the light changed, and then we went back inside where the family was waiting. The pot roast was gone. The good china would go back in its cabinet. Gerald would tell the fishing story again at Christmas, and Joanne would generate her particular weather, and the boys would grow up and become whatever they were going to become. But I would remember this dinner as the one where a single quiet sentence cracked something open, not to break it, but to let light in, to make room at the table for the whole truth of us. Our luck, our loss, our distance, our love, our dead, our living, and the small sleeping child upstairs who would inherit all of it. Every family gets to have that, 4 words, and the whole house fell silent because she was right and because we needed to hear it.